Welcome to Breaking Indecision. Decisions can be hard, especially in a post-information world. Whether it's your phone, computer, internet, or frankly, just being bombarded by social media, information is literally everywhere. So how is it that we make good decisions? How is it that we know what decision we're making is the right one? Over the next coming weeks, we're going to explore exactly that with experts, knowledgeable professors, and the leaders in making or breaking indecision.
Sometimes in life you say, how am I here right now with these amazing people? And I'm just totally honored to be here with you all.
That right there is me, your host, Kinsley Trigger Jordan, loving the conversation, surrounded by experts.
What we're looking at is this concept of the post-information age, where we're going really, and how we can help our decision makers.
Meet Yves Gagnon, always an incredible perspective and quick with a laugh.
So my name is Matthew Brown. I'm an active duty U.S. Air Force officer assigned to the RAF on exchange.
Meet the creative mind and part-time cat herder behind these amazing discussions.
And what we started to do and now developed into a full-blown approach is called naturalizing sense-making.
And welcome our honored guest, Professor Dave Snowden. You'll want to sit down for this amazing episode as we learn about the Cynefin Framework in a post-information age with founder and professor Dave Snowden.
So without further ado, I'm going to kick off a little bit of an introduction for Professor Dave Snowden's with us from Wales. Fairly influential in terms of his thought, and I don't want to speak for you. Would you mind talking a little bit about one of the things that you're most, I guess, notorious for or most well known for is the Cynefin Framework?
Yeah, that's one of three major frameworks which we've created. So the basic principle of what we do as a group, and it originated in IBM until IBM just became unsurvivable. Yeah. And so I left, worked with the Singapore government on the risk assessment system. And that really picked work I'd done on DARPA on counterterrorism. So I led a big DARPA program, Genoa 2, or co-led to be more precise. What we started to do and now developed into a full-blown approach is called naturalizing sense-making. So sense-making, it's one of 5 schools of sense-making. It has a hyphen. Whether it has a hyphen or not really matters, by the way. If sense-making has a hyphen, it's a verb. If it hasn't got a hyphen, it's a noun. And that for me is important. So I define sense-making as how do you make sense of the world so that you can act in it. And with that comes a key concept of sufficiency. You never know everything you need to know, but what type of action can you take on the basis of the knowledge you have? And naturalizing means to root what we do in the natural sciences. So we take a physics approach to research and a non-inductive approach. So we don't go and study what people do and try and derive general principles. Because to be honest, from a physics point of view, no social scientist ever has enough data to form any conclusion anyway. So what we actually do is we start with what we know about cognitive neuroscience, about the nature of systems. We divide methods and tools consistent with those principles. And then we'll spend maybe 4 or 5 years really working those in practice till we're comfortable. But that's a different approach. It's a it's practice derived from theory rather than theory derived from practice. So that's what we do.
So all that's really interesting. What I found, because I've introduced and I didn't make the connection until later on, that the framework you're talking about for sense making, and for those that might be familiar, you got sort of a simple, complicated and complex and then chaotic. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit how that framework deals with sense making, and then we'll roll that into decision making in just a moment.
Okay. Yeah, and it's actually taught at command level in all the US Armed Forces. If you want to be colonel level in any of them, you'll get Cynefin at some stage, which I'm quite proud of, actually. Fundamentally, Cynefin works off 3 basic systems. Yeah, so ordered, complex, and chaotic systems. And that kind of like relates to what happens in nature. So an ordered system has a high level of constraint, so everything is predictable. So, in the US, people drive on the right. In the UK, people drive on the left. We create enough constraints. We got predictability. And human beings are really good at that, by the way. We create rules and structures and formals and rituals which give us predictability. A complex system is one where everything is entangled with everything else. And the key principle of a complex adaptive system is that the only thing you can say with any absolute certainty is any intervention will produce unintended consequences. So the most important thing to understand about a complex system is you have no causality. That's actually really scary for people trained in a Northern European, North American tradition. It's actually much easier to understand from Africa, Celtic fringe, Southern Europe, because the philosophies there stayed open to that. So in a system without causality, all you can do is influence what we call modulators. So I'll give you a metaphor to explain that. If you think about a series of magnets around a table, and some of them you control, some are controlled by people you know, some you've got no idea who's controlling them, but they're changing. And on the top of the table, there are cast iron discs. The table has a high coefficient of resistance in case anybody wants to be pedantic. Yeah, and if all of the magnets keep the same strength and the same polarity, the discs form a stable pattern. If I change one magnet, I can predict it. If I change two magnets, I can predict it. If I change three magnets, I can no longer predict it. Yeah? Now, those magnets are what we call modulation, or modulators. And if you think about it, if you stand above the system and you look at the discs and you control the modulators you can control, you can actually manage the emergence of the system, because you can constantly make micro adjustments based on a real-time feedback loop. So we basically say complex systems are modulated, and the modulators have propensities, they have predictability, and what you then get from that is a dispositional state, which is a probability state that you can measure. A chaotic system, in our terms, is a system without effective constraint. Now, chaos means different things in different bodies of knowledge, so we all have to define our terms. I mean without effective constraints. And we sometimes use a metaphor to explain that of solid, liquid, and gas. So solid is order, liquid is complex, difficult to contain, but everything's connected. Gas, everything is disparate, nothing is connected with everything else. And that allows us to introduce a key concept, which is the phase shift. So if you think about latent heat, you heat water up to 100 degrees, it doesn't become steam until you put more heat in. I smelt snow coming a couple of days ago because I grew up in the country and I can smell it when it's coming. The reason is that there's heat thrown out as the liquid becomes solid, right? And that changes the chemical composition. And if you recognize it, you've been trained for it, you can pick it up. So that gives us the three core domains, but then you have the triple point, if you think about it in physics and chemistry. It's a point of balance of pressure and temperature where it's equiprobable whether something will become solid, liquid, or gas. And in Cynefin, that's the central domain that everybody forgets about, but is the most important one, which is now called the aporetic domain. Aporia is a Greek phrase. So if you don't know the answer in the Greek classroom, you stand up and say, I have an aporia. It's a Greek word. What it means is a question which you can't answer without thinking differently. And we have a whole body of methods around how do you create aporetic moments, particularly in battlefield, in command and control, because the danger of pattern entrainment is really high. So the basic principle of Cynefin is go into the center and then break into the other domains. And then we divide order into two, clear and complicated. It used to be called simple and complicated. And that's kind of like not a phase shift, that's just an artificial boundary. So it's the difference between whether everybody understands something or only experts understand something. But the principle is there is a right answer. So the fundamental principle of the Cynefin framework is to decide what type of system you're in at what level of granularity. Right? And that's key because people talk about whole systems. Aspects of a system will be ordered, aspects will be complex, aspects should be chaotic at times. All right. And so the principle is get the granularity right, work what it out, and then there are different decision models dependent on which domain you're in. And that's basically Cynefin.
Do you then, so as a decision maker, are you faced with all three of these situations at any given time?
Continuously. I mean, if you look at the European Union Field Guide on how to manage complexity in crisis, and I was the principal author on that, And that's actually an important booklet, because that was the first time any major government has endorsed a purely complexity approach without contaminating it with systems thinking. So I use the word contamination deliberately and with malice aforethought, right? So what that says is the role of a leader is generally to coordinate. As you get higher up the chain, you make fewer and fewer decisions. You're mostly putting people together in different ways. Unless there's a crisis where you have to act decisively, not to solve the problem, but to increase the options available. The essence of crisis management is to increase options available, not try and solve the problem because you can't. Yeah. Now in Cynefin, that's where you shift it from chaos into the apparatic domain. And then you identify which aspects are ordered, which aspects are complex. Which aspects do you need to generate more hypotheses than you've got? Well, then you make that chaotic, because that's what that does. And there's a whole series of movements that you make. So that's the basic principle. Yeah. Start in the apparatic, break things up, divide them into the different spaces, take different actions, put them back together again. But that sounds reductionist. It isn't. You're going to what's called the lowest level of coherent granularity. Yeah. So you're not saying the whole is made up of the parts, but you're saying we can map the modulators, we can map the energy gradients, we can map these things. We can manage those and monitor for emergence. So what you manage changes radically based on different domains. Simple way of understanding that, by the way, if you look at the origin of the word manage in English, it actually comes from an Italian word, which I will not attempt to pronounce, which is the ability to ride a horse in dressage. It then gets corrupted by the French. Many things have been corrupted by the French, not as many as by the English, but many, to mean household management. Right? So what you actually have is ménage and manage. Right? Now, both are valid. In a complex system, you're riding horses. In an ordered system, you're managing a household budget. And leaders have to have the ability to understand what aspects of the system are in those domains, because the management process is actually very different.
So picking up on that, you talked about reductionist thought, and I know you've been pretty critical with trying to oversimplify things that are complicated or even chaotic. How does your definition of chaotic align with wicked problems? And then with your sense-making model, are you saying that, because it sounds similar when we start talking about a systems thinking of trying to understand or trying to seek understanding, and maybe I'm misunderstanding what systems thinking is.
No, well,
because I agree with what you're saying, but I also agree that we want to understand.
Well, first of all, I think systems thinking has always tried to address complex problems, and you can see that they talk about managing complexity. Yeah, but there are a couple of key differences. One is every systems thinking writer I know defines a system as having boundaries, whereas from a complexity point of view, not all systems have boundaries, and that's actually really important. Yeah. Secondly, if you look at systems dynamics, they create these tight causal feedback loops, and there's a famous case in Afghanistan on that, where a group of people in the Pentagon said, if we ever understand that model, we'll have solved the problem, if you remember that one. Yeah. So that implied lots of micro-causality, which systems dynamics does. Cybernetics does the same thing. So if you look at it, systems thinking arose out of information science. And even if it didn't, that's how it got defined by Shannon and Ashby and so on, with the birth of computing. Whereas complexity comes from chemistry and biology in the main. And there are some intersection points, and both use ecological metaphors, but they're there. And the thing I've always said is systems thinking did its really best to tackle complexity. It did really well on it. But we built canals and understood gravity before Newton. After Newton, we had the science. Right? We now know the science of complex adaptive systems, and we actually know far more about human cognition. And this key factor, we now understand the mathematics and the behavior of systems without causality at any level. Yeah? And that changes the game. Now, hence my comment. So I'm showing all due respect, as I would show all due respect to Newtonian science, which is still valid within constraints, but it doesn't apply at quantum level, and so on. It's called bounded applicability within our lexicon. Different things work in different domains, and nothing should claim universality.
As you can tell, this conversation just got started with Professor Dave Snowden, so join us again.
And make sure you follow along and subscribe so you can catch part 2 of this same discussion.
If you'd like to join us for future episodes of Breaking Indecision,
Make sure you follow along on YouTube, Spotify, Anchor, and anywhere podcasts are available. Join us next week as we bring more experts, professors, and industry leaders to help us decide what information we need, how to sort through it, how to prioritize it, so that we can make the best decisions possible. Thanks for joining us again, and follow along with the Trilateral Strategic Steering Group on LinkedIn. See you next week.